Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about unnecessary code. So let's get into it. So I got this question where this person asked, all right, I have this developer, or if a developer wrote several hundred lines of code unnecessarily, should they be fired? And I think that's an odd question. I'm not going to say that it's a good question. I think it's a bit of an odd question if we just kind of walk through this. So, like, what's the context here? Well, I didn't really get much more information than this. So, I mean, if somebody wrote, I don't know, 500 or 200 or 1,000 lines of code unnecessarily, the first question that I would ask, and the most important question is to ask, well, why did they write that code? Because without the why, how could you possibly know if it's a justified thing? You see, one of the biggest lies when it comes to software development is that a software developer always knows what to do. They don't. Being a software developer is very much about the journey of discovery a lot of the time. And even if you tell a software developer what it is that you want, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have given them from a stakeholder's perspective. Even if you think that you made things super clear, it might actually be that you didn't, because even if you are able to give the absolute most specific specification out there, odds are still that you're going to overlook things. There might already be existing features or existing behavior that gets discovered as you kind of go along. And this is where things kind of get important, because when a programmer works, or rather when we work, there is this sweet spot of planning that you can make before you start working, and you can make some assumptions based on your current understanding of the system. But then you get to this point where you can't really answer any more questions or really figure out how to specifically implement the feature without writing some code first, because you don't have, and I've said this many times before, nobody can have the entire system in their head. It's not possible. So you have to actually start working a little bit on a few assumptions and then see where that kind of takes you. And then you learn some more about the system, and then you realize if you had assumptions that were incorrect, or if there are additional questions that needs to be answered. And this is kind of where the waterfall method fails, because that's the way that we used to work, where all right, you had a set of specifications, you try to plan out everything perfectly ahead of time, and then you come to new realizations later on. That usually leads to, because you don't have this back and forth of this continuous feedback cycle, that usually leads to you being forced to make certain assumptions about something, because you're not actually talking to your stakeholders. In an agile methodology, on the other hand, it's basically about writing the least amount of code up to a certain point where you have additional questions, asking those questions, and then continuing along. And that's the thing that is important here, because if a developer gets to a point where it's unclear what they need to do in order to deliver on the feature or the project or whatever they're going to deliver, I'm assuming that this is just a feature, because 500 lines or like 1,000, I mean, if a few hundred lines of code is not going to be a meaningful project. But if they get to a certain point and they make an assumption, because they, the specifications were unclear, or if they were scared or somehow were unable to get answers to the questions that they had at that given time in a reasonable amount of time, then they're basically forced into a situation where they now either have to say that, I'm sorry, I can't continue working now, or they just have to kind of hack it together and make some assumptions based on their own judgment, because they didn't have the information necessary, right? And if that is the case, who made the mistake? Who is to blame? If you ask a construction worker to build a building and all you say is that it's going to have 20 stories, that leaves a lot of room for somebody to make assumptions and create a building that may not be to the stakeholders or like the client's specification. And see, that's the problem with software development. A lot of you have to go into painful detail if you want the exact thing that you're looking for. Without that painful detail, you leave things ambiguous. You leave it open to interpretation. And then when you come back and you realize that, damn, this isn't what I wanted, then the software developer might, depending on situation, either be able to continue the work or change the code a little bit, or they might have to start over from scratch, depending on how far down into the feature they already built and what assumptions they made before they started writing code. Now, this is the thing that separates a good software developer or a very productive software developer from a bad one. And I've said this in a few videos as well. You see, a lot of software developers may think that the biggest challenge is to write the code, but quite a lot of the time, the biggest challenge is actually to figure out what code that you actually need to write. And having a lack of social skills or having a lack of understanding how important it is to understand the stakeholder that they are building something for is one of the biggest shortcomings of software developers today. Because if you get to a point where you make an assumption and your assumption could have been fact-checked towards a customer or towards your boss, your manager, or something like that, and you just keep on working, and then they come in and they say, oh, what are you doing? This is not what we wanted, and then they kind of have to do the whole thing over. If this happens like once, it's something that you can correct. It's bad behavior, but you can correct it. But if this is a continuous thing that a person does, then I would very much argue that if you can't change that behavior within an individual, if they're stubborn or something like that, then for sure you need to fire them. Because basically what they're doing is that they are unable to understand that they have a limitation in their workflow that is costing the company money. If you have someone who works until a point where they're unsure and then takes the time to ask and make sure, so that they can make sure that the next thing that they are going to build is actually going to be the correct thing, and then you have somebody who just makes a bunch of assumptions and kind of play the rock star game and just, hey, this is cool, I'll just go, you kind of do it, and they build the wrong thing, and then they have to undo things and then redo them until they actually, they're going through the same process. It's the same process, just that the one is more efficient than the other. And having that at a systematic level or as a behavior, it's a no-go within software development. So what I want you to take away from this is that the first thing to ask when it comes to, are you going to fire somebody who did unnecessary work, is to figure out if they did unnecessary work because their specifications were unclear, or if you have a work process within your company that makes it very punishing it makes it hard to get answers to your questions when a programmer is working. Because if you create ambiguous, kind of sloppy specifications, or you're not available to ask and answer questions when somebody needs to figure something out when they work, then I don't see the programmer being the problem in this scenario. Then it's a stakeholder problem. But if you have a person who avoids communication or just assumes that they know how to do things and then keeps on fucking up in this manner, then you need to get rid of them. Or at the very least, give them a really ample opportunity to change their behavior. I have worked with people like this, and these are the sort of programmers that just causes problems. You need to get them out there. The lone wolves who think that they can just produce a feature without talking to anybody are usually the sort of people who are either geniuses, and these are very rare, or it's the sort of people that we're talking about, that they just create waste. I'm sorry to say. Have a great day.